Some of the best types of UFO cases involve sightings with many witnesses, while much more rare than UFO sightings with one or two witnesses, reports with a large number are taken much more seriously, even by skeptics. In Japan, in the early 19th century, a strange ship washed ashore on the beach. The incident was seen by many, and perhaps more importantly, was documented in various Japanese writings. Since then, it has led many to research and ask, what was this craft? And perhaps more importantly, who was this strange woman inside it? In this episode, we will investigate this Japanese incident, a case that came to be known as Utsuro-Bune, or the Hollow Ship Story. On February 22, 1803, several men were fishing just off the shores of Hariadori Beach in the Hitachi region when they would spot a strange boat in the waves. The men noticed the ship wasn't big and decided to tow it back to shore. As they brought it back, people began to gather on the beach, wondering just what it was. Once it was ashore, they were able to observe the strange craft in more detail. It had a dome-like top that was colored dark red. The bottom was dome-shaped too, although more elongated, and was covered with something that resembled brass metal plates. The craft was around 11 feet tall and 18 feet wide, with windows covered by bars on the upper half. In general, it didn't look like anything that the fishermen nor anyone else had ever seen. What would happen next, though, would truly shock the onlookers. A young woman who appeared foreign and of European descent exited the craft. The woman was estimated to be around 5 feet tall. She had red hair and also had white hair extensions made of some type of fur. She appeared elegant and was wearing what appeared to be silk clothes. She also carried a box in front of her. The purpose of the box couldn't be ascertained by the Japanese citizens. All we know in regards to the box is that the woman was very protective over it and wouldn't let anyone touch it. The woman would begin speaking to the people. However, she wasn't speaking Japanese, and no one knew what she was trying to communicate. As a result, who she was and what she wanted was a complete mystery. As word reached the leader of the village, the town elder speculated that the woman might have been outcast from a foreign land because she had married against her father's will, or possibly she had cheated on her husband. At a crossroads, and not wanting to get drawn into a potential conflict if they helped her, the town elders decided to put her back in the ship and drag it out to sea. The strange boat was never seen again by the townspeople. Interestingly, this isn't the first time a case like this had happened in Japan during this time. Around the same time, sometime prior, there were reports of a strange ship similar in appearance washing up on a Japanese beach not too far away. In addition, a woman, similar to the one described, was on board the ship. Over the years, the story, and ones like it, have been examined by many due to the abundance of documents on the scene that day. In addition, there are other stories of hollow ships washing up around Japan during that time. Many of the details are very similar among the events. There's a number of documents that mention this story. In fact, several Japanese newspapers from the early 19th century tell very similar stories. These include Tales from the Rabbit Garden, published in 1825, Stories from Drifters, around 1835, and Dust of the Plume, from 1844. It's important to point out, too, that these are just several of the more well-known sources, as others exist, too. This incident has been explored and has raised questions around what exactly the ship was and who was the woman. We know several things. This event seemed very likely to occur, as multiple sources have documented around Japan. In addition, we pretty much know this woman wasn't from Japan based on her description, and also the ship didn't appear to be Japanese. That said, there are traditional Japanese boats known as taira-bune, which are circular, open log boats, but these are quite different than the descriptions of the hollow ship. Generally, There appears to be two main theories on who this woman was and what the ship was. The first is that the woman and ship were from some type of European country or other Western country. The description of the woman supports this theory. However, most of the facts around it don't make sense. If a woman was banished, it seems almost certain she would have died at sea, unless of course she was dropped off near the Sea of Japan. Also, by all accounts, the woman looked healthy. Was she dropped off with the intent to allow the Japanese to imprison her? Possibly, but this seems unlikely. This has led many to speculate and support the second theory. This is that the woman was an extraterrestrial and the craft somehow malfunctioned. It was reported there was strange writing inside it, and even though Japanese citizens wouldn't recognize English letters, it's a bit odd that there would be writing inside the craft. Some speculate that this was some sort of survival pod. It does bear a remarkable resemblance to the pods used by NASA astronauts when they return to Earth. Perhaps a craft malfunctioned mid-flight and the being jumped in this escape pod. The being description itself seems to support this theory too. She was said to be wearing expensive clothes and didn't appear to be unhealthy or malnourished. The last question in this story concerns what was the box. One thought is that it could have been some sort of tracking device and that it would help her to be found. Unfortunately, this case has no remaining physical evidence nor witnesses that can be interviewed. We do, though, have a treasure trove of documents indicating something strange washed up on the shore that day. Perhaps in time, we will discover another document that reveals more about this strange event and who exactly this woman was and what her ship was as well. In Potosi, Bolivia, 1968, one of the most famous alien encounters in the country's history would occur. The story concerns a young woman witnessing a strange entity mutilating her sheep and ultimately having an altercation with the bizarre being. The case truly stands out as a mild-mannered peasant brawled with an extraterrestrial. There's not many cases of humans fighting with aliens, as often witnesses are terrified beyond belief and choose to flee. For this young woman, though, when her fight-or-flight response kicked in, she clearly chose to fight. Despite this, even 30 years after the event, when interviewed, the woman was still terrified of what happened to her that day. In this episode, we will examine this strange and classic Bolivian story, a case that came to be known as the Potosi Sheep Slayer. Just outside Ayacucho, Bolivia, in the late 1960s, Valentina Flores, then 24 years old, and her husband, Gumercindo, were living a humble lifestyle. The two Quechua Indians were focused on tending to their livestock and raising their infant child, Theodosia. The two lived an isolated life with little contact with the outside world. As such, the two had no familiarity nor interest with extraterrestrials and UFOs, and were focused on making a living with their livestock. Sometime after Easter in 1968, Valentina would have an experience she would never forget. That day, her husband, Gumercindo, like all the men in the area, had been mandated to go to Las Pampas. Valentina was alone, along with Theodosia. Around 4 p.m., Valentina, with Theodosia strapped to her back in a manta, began herding her flock of sheep, only to discover some llama were missing. She herded the sheep into a grazing field and then went listening for the missing llamas. Valentina began tracking them, and after around 45 minutes, caught up with them. She started directing them back to the grazing field, but when she arrived, the sheep had ran off. She left the llamas behind and soon tracked the sheep to a stone corral. From a distance, she couldn't make out many details yet, but she was perplexed as to why they went in there. Even more strange, it was quiet, very quiet. As Valentina approached, what she saw next would leave her stunned. there was some sort of web-like transparent covering over the corral. She couldn't see everything inside it though, and soon silently crept up to see what was going on. As she looked through the opening in the corral, Valentina would be stunned to see sheep corpses everywhere. They were disemboweled and slaughtered in a horrifying fashion. Even worse, there was something inside the corral murdering them. The being was around 3 to 4 feet tall, and butchering the sheep with some sort of device with a razor-sharp hook. It appeared to be attached to a chain. The being was on one knee at this time and was wearing strange clothing like a wetsuit. It had brown boots, red straps that covered the chest in an X shape and appeared to support some type of backpack. It was wearing a helmet with a propeller on top. Valentina could see its face. The being had white, pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a bright red mustache. Valentina was furious when she saw the entity killing her sheep and lambs. This was her family's livelihood. She began throwing rocks at the entity and yelling at it. The being then stood up in shock and jumped over to a strange device. He started winding it, and the elastic webbing rolled into the device. At this point, Valentina would spot a second entity inside the corral. The second being ran out and then up a hill on the outside. The entity sat on some sort of chair, and then it soon took off into the sky. Valentina, furious at this point, was then left with just the one being. She walked in the corral surrounded by sheep's corpses and walked toward the creature. The being began talking to Valentina in an unknown language, but Valentina wasn't interested. Furious, she grabbed her club and struck it right in the head. Blood spattered, and the entity screamed. The entity at this point began to realize it needed to defend itself. It grabbed the hooked object it used for slaughtering the sheep and threw it at Valentina's chest. The sharp blade landed right into her manta's thick knot, effectively saving her life. A chain then pulled the blade back to the being, and a fearless Valentina refused to back down. She ran at the entity and hit it in the arm with her stick. Once again it bled, but this time it decided not to strike back. It grabbed the mechanical box and ran off, soon disappearing into the sky. Valentina would notify her husband soon and the local officials. Soon after that, the Bolivian army arrived and began investigating. There were sheep carcasses everywhere, at least 60. The bodies were missing internal and external organs, and even more strange, most or all of the blood appeared to be drained from many of the corpses. Although there is no proof, there is a belief that the Bolivian government collected the alien blood at the scene, and somewhere this blood is still stored. The Bolivian military would canvass the area and soon question other ranchers and farmers in the region. They would soon learn that during this time, many ranchers had experienced strange activity. For example, several stated they had found mutilated corpses drained of the blood and also seen odd beings running out of the corrals. Due to their livelihood gone, Valentina and her family would be forced to move south. In 2001, UFO investigator J.J. Benitez traveled to Bolivia to interview Valentina. She would relay the story to him. Perhaps the most interesting detail of the case was that Valentina was unfamiliar with extraterrestrials and UFOs. Although frightened, she didn't seem to make the connection. What can we make of this case? It's odd to say the least, and there are several things that seem to support it. One is that it doesn't appear the witness was fabricating the story. By all accounts, she seems to be credible. Also, there are questions as to why she would do this. For example, why would she slaughter 60 of her sheep and her family's livelihood? In addition, many others reported strange similar activity at the time of the incident, and it was investigated by the military. It appears to be such a strange story. It almost feels like this one couldn't be made up. Despite this, many critics say the case is flimsy. There was only one eyewitness, and some question whether a peasant woman carrying a newborn would viciously attack an unknown creature, especially one with a weapon. Could it be the case the family needed to abandon their lives for some reason? We know it couldn't be to collect an insurance payout, as no one, or the majority of ranchers, didn't have insurance back then for their livestock. Her motivation doesn't appear to be financial in any way. Still, perhaps Valentina was tired of the secluded life and just wanted to leave the isolation. This raises the question around the internal and external organs. Would she really have had the time to butcher 60 sheep and also remove all the organs? It seems far-fetched to think she would do this. One thing this case has going for it, though, is the livestock mutilations. Mutilations are still reported today and are quite common. Often strange activity occurs before and after them. There's cases of cows and other livestock being abducted, and even reports of abductees seeing them on crafts. While we may never know the truth about this event, this case has become quite popular, not only in Bolivia, but around the world. On January 7th, 1970, Swedish cross-country skiers Arno Heinonen and Esko Viho were out training in the woods of Imjarvi, Finland for an upcoming competition. Arno was 36 years old at the time and working as a woodman, while Esko was aged 38 and worked as a farmer. Both men lived simple lives. However, that day, they would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of Finland. The incident produced adverse health effects in both men and was considered to be quite credible early on. However, one of the men, Arno, alleged to have continued contact with the beings, which led many to cast doubt on the original story. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable 1970 alien encounter that happened in the city of Imjarvi, Finland. Around 4:45 in the afternoon, as the sun was setting, after cross-country skiing for most of the day, the two Finnish skiers decided to stop in a clearing and rest. The day was extremely cold, with complete visibility in the sky, and the two men were looking forward to wrapping up their training session and heading home. After about 5 minutes of standing in the clearing, the men began to hear a faint buzzing sound. They looked up to the north and saw a light which was moving toward them, and soon it began descending. As the light came closer and closer to the ground, soon the men saw that the light was surrounded by a reddish-grayish cloud. As the craft came down to about 50 feet, they noticed that inside the cloud sat some sort of craft or object. It was around 10 feet long and had a dome on top, appearing to be composed of some type of metal. The craft then began to hover over them while continuing to descend, and the men could now see the underside. There was a short tube protruding out from the center. Interestingly, the tube was very small, being only about 10 inches round. As the craft kept coming lower, the gray-reddish mist dissipated and the buzzing sound turned down to a faint noise. At this point, the craft was only around 10 to 12 feet above the men. Then, an extremely bright light shot down from the craft. The light lit up the snow and seemed to blacken the edges of it somehow. The light spread out as it descended and appeared to be around 2 feet in diameter on the surface. The two men were stunned, speechless, and not saying a word to one another during this time. Still, it's important to note they didn't appear to be scared. Then inside the light, a creature would suddenly appear. Neither man saw the being descend from the light, but rather just suddenly become visible. The being was quite small and thin, being shorter than 3 feet. It had on green overalls and also darker green boots. The being appeared to have a hooked nose and also was wearing some type of coned helmet. Neither man seemed to be able to recall the eyes which is somewhat odd. This could be due to the bright light obscuring it somehow, though. The creature was carrying some type of black box. There was some sort of bright yellow light coming out of it that was flashing. Initially, the light was shining between the two men and not hitting them directly. Then the being turned slightly, and the bright light hit Arno. At that time, a gray mist floated down into the forest, and something that appeared as sparks began flying from the area in the snow where the light was. The sparks, which were multicolored, hit the men, and soon the gray-red smoke was so thick that the men couldn't see the being or even each other. Then suddenly the men saw the white light from the craft shoot up, and both the light and the being disappeared. At the same time, the smoke vanished, along with the craft. The men were surprised by the events, but unlike most, they reported they weren't that scared. They were even telling some jokes during the event. However, they would soon come to realize this wasn't a laughing matter. Immediately after the craft vanished, both men experienced damaging physical effects. Arno tried to walk, but his leg was so numb that he fell in the snow. He recalled his right leg just gave out, since that probably had the most contact with the light. Arno was forced to sit down. Cisco initially thought this was a joke, but soon came to realize that Arno was serious. Cisco was forced to drag his friend down the rest of the mountain. They went around 3 kilometers and arrived at Arno's mom's house. She would later recall the men looked like they were in bad shape, but not really scared. Cisco's face was red and swollen. Arno was in much worse shape though. His back was hurting as well as his joints. He soon was vomiting and his urine turned black. Things would only get worse for Arno though. He was treated by a doctor, but even after 10 days the symptoms remained. He couldn't work, was extremely lethargic, had trouble balancing, and began having problems with his memory too. Dr. Polykhozhanajo, who examined Arno, couldn't explain the black urine. He thought it could be blood in the urine, but he stated that that wouldn't last for months like Arno experienced. Cisco would have adverse health effects too. He had issues with his eyes and headaches for days after the event and saw Dr. Khozhanajo. Dr. Khozhanajo thought the men could have been exposed to something radioactive. While the men made some incredible claims, there were reports of others seeing strange lights in the area that night as well. Elna Stellari, who worked on a farm around 10 kilometers away, reported seeing a strange light. Also, a boy in Paso reported seeing an odd light too. In June of 1970, the two men would revisit the site with the journalist. Oddly, when the men and the journalist arrived, the hands of all three began to turn red and swelled up. Arno would report getting a crippling headache as well. While the initial sighting was deemed pretty credible by ufologists, subsequent claims by Arno would come to damage the credibility of the case. After the initial sighting, Arno would claim to have been visited by the beings at least 23 more times. Arno has a number of incredible stories from his encounters, many of which seem outlandish. For example, on one encounter, Arno alleged he heard a female voice telepathically guide him to a secluded spot in the woods. There, he would meet a gorgeous woman, or what looked like a woman. She was around 5 feet tall, had blonde hair cropped to her shoulders, and blue eyes. The being hovered or floated over to Arno, communicating with him in Finnish. She told him she was 180 years old, although she looked 20. She went on to tell him that he had met several different types of aliens from her planet. Arno would claim to speak with the woman one more time. On his second meeting, Arno attempted to photograph her, and according to Arno, she disappeared right as the photo snapped. He also alleged he tried to take a photo of the craft, but as he was raising his camera, it flew out of his hands. Arno's accounts of his interactions and subsequent events have led many ufologists to doubt his story. Without question, the later events have hurt his credibility. For example, Arno alleges to have received a green pen from the beings, but then says he misplaced it. Also, The reports around the cameras have led many to cast doubt on his story. This has led some to believe the initial story was true, but the effects experienced by the initial encounter have damaged him psychologically. Some speculate this has led to delusions and hallucinations. Still, while many of Arno's later claims sound like fiction, the initial encounter does appear to have some credible elements. 1. Both men experienced severe adverse health effects for quite some time. These were cross-country skiers in peak condition, and the event left them in a very fragile state. It seems unlikely they would be able to fabricate this. In addition, there were 2 witnesses, and both their stories were extremely similar. It's important to point out too that it's possible Arno was telling the truth about the later events. Many of the stories have elements similar to other alien encounters, such as telepathic communication and beings that appear attractive. Could it be the case Arno liked the attention from the initial encounter and fabricated the later stories? It's surely a possibility. Unfortunately for Arno and Esco, though, evidence for these close encounters of the third kind in the UFO community is based almost primarily on witness credibility, and after Arno told his later stories, he lost almost all the credibility he first had. In 1954 in Italy, there were hundreds of reports of UFOs around the country. In a prior episode, we covered one of these famous cases in which thousands of individuals spotted several UFOs directly above a soccer stadium during a game. This case occurred on October 27, 1954, in the Tuscany region of Florence. Just 4 days later, on November 1st, a woman named Rosa Lotti reported a strange alien encounter that has been deemed one of the most credible in Italian history. There were multiple witnesses, physical evidence left at the scene, and Rosa was deemed to be a reliable witness. In this episode, we will examine this famous case, an event that became to be known as the Cennina case. On Monday, November 1st, 1954, Rosa Lotti, an Italian peasant, would have a life-changing experience. Rosa was 46 years old at the time and a mother of 4 children residing on a farm named La Collina between the towns of Cennina and Caponoli. Rosa didn't go into town much and spent most of her time working long hours on the farm. This day, though, was very different. It was a Catholic holiday, and Rosa, being very religious, planned on walking into Cennina to visit her church in the cemetery there. She planned on placing carnations at the altar of the Madonna Pellegrina. Around 6:30 to 7 a.m., Rosa began her walk towards Cennina. She would walk on a footpath that cut through the fields and woods that she had traveled many times, carrying some clothes to change into when she arrived, and walking barefoot. Rosa planned on changing just prior into getting into the city so she wouldn't get her clothes or shoes dirty. Around 7:30 a.m., Rosa walked into a small clearing, which had a few small bushes and trees in it. She had crossed over this clearing before, but this time would be different. As she walked into the clearing, she would spot a bizarre object close to a tree. It was like nothing she had ever seen before. It was spindle-shaped, around 3 feet wide at its widest part, and around 6 to 8 feet long. On the lower half of the object, there was a door in which 2 seats could be seen. There was a window in the center portion, and the craft was gray, appearing shiny. A stunned Rosa watched the craft, and her attention turned towards something even more strange. Behind the craft, there were 2 bizarre beings. They were small, around 3 feet tall, and wearing a one-piece, tight-fitted suit with some sort of cape on their back. They wore helmets that were golden brown, similar to old Leatherhead helmets. Their bodies were in proportion and were similar to a 5 or 6-year-old. One unique feature of the beings was their upper lip was curved, so their teeth were always exposed. Generally, though, They looked very similar to humans. The beings then began approaching Rosa and were speaking in some type of strange language, which she compared to Chinese. They appeared friendly and were laughing, seeming to have a good time. Although the beings appeared friendly, Rosa was frightened. Then shockingly, the beings suddenly grabbed Rosa's stockings and flowers. Rosa took issue with this in a timid manner, which seemed to prompt one of them to hand some of the flowers back. The beings then wrapped the remaining flowers, about 5, in the stocking and tossed them in the craft. The beings then went inside the spindle and pulled out some sort of white package. As they turned back around, Rosa had already took off running. After Rosa was a little bit further away, she looked back and the craft was gone. Rosa wouldn't stop running until she got into Cennina. There, she would run into a friend, Anita Valenti. Anita immediately noticed something was wrong with her, and Rosa told her the story. Rosa would then inform the Italian National Police Force, and also the priest of the church she was going to visit. Rosa and the police went back to the scene, and there the police found a deep hole in the ground where the craft had been. Word spread around too, and soon many people began heading down the path to check out the site. Initially, the investigation focused on Rosa's story and the encounter. As more ufologists began looking into the case, though, it soon became apparent there were many others who witnessed something that day. Luigi Danini and his daughter would allege to see some type of object descend down from the sky into the woods. They initially thought it was a meteor, but it slowed down. Romaldo Berti, then 25 years old, claims on the day of the incident, he saw what he described as a luminous rocket that was like a cigar. It had flames coming out of the tail and flew out of Cennina woods. Perhaps the most interesting story, though, comes from 2 boys, Ampolino Torzini, age 6, and his older brother, age 9. They spotted Rosa talking to the strange beings in the woods. They would run back and tell their father, and when they returned, the object and Rosa were gone. However, they did see the deep hole in the ground. In addition to these witnesses, there was a hunter who claims while he was out in the woods that morning, he saw the object land in the woods. Multiple independent witnesses would see this craft in Cennina around the same time as Rosa's experience. Reports were very similar, and some said the object stopped and hovered for several moments as if it was about to land. One of the more interesting aspects of this case is that the craft appeared to return the same day of Rosa's encounter around midnight. On November 1st, 1954, Giuliano and Tosco Colselli were sleeping when they were awoken by screams outside. They ran outside, and a man on a motorcycle named Marcello Giovanni was looking up at the sky. The 3 of them would watch as the UFO floated and then disappeared behind some hills. Giovanni would later recall it emitted a bluish-white light and was completely silent. As mentioned previously, in 1954 Italy and other Western countries, they experienced a rash of UFO reports. So what can we make of Rosa's case? Rosa's case appears to have several credible aspects to it. First, there were many reports of this specific UFO in Cennina and around Cennina during that time, including the same day of Rosa's sightings. Also, there were witnesses at the scene who claimed to have seen Rosa talking with the entities. One other factor has to do with Rosa herself. She was deemed highly credible. Not only did the ufologists believe her, but many of the townspeople found her story to be credible and stated she was reliable. The physical evidence found at the scene seems to support her story, although the evidence isn't overwhelming. It's possible Rosa could have dug that hole herself, although this raises the question of why. With all the UFO reports happening around the country at the time, was Rosa trying to achieve fame and possibly fortune? It seems like a possibility. However, more likely than not, she probably wasn't interested in it. By all accounts, Rosa lived a quiet life and rarely left her farm. She was very religious, and it doesn't appear that she was trying to fabricate the story. Over the years, Rosa has been interviewed and questioned by a variety of professionals, including the police, ufologists, and even family and friends. Her story has remained consistent. In addition, the one-piece, tight-fitted silver suits is an outfit that we have reported many times on this channel. Rosa's story is one of many that occurred during this busy period of UFO activity in Italy in the 1950s. In future episodes, we'll explore more of these cases from 1950s Italy. On October 17, 1973, Jeff Greenhaw, the police chief of Falkville, Alabama, received a strange call from a resident. The frantic person reported a UFO craft had descended on a nearby field. Off duty at the time, Chief Greenhaw grabbed his revolver along with a Polaroid camera and headed over to see what was happening. When he arrived, there was no UFO. However, something else was there. Something that changed Captain Greenhaw's life forever. In this episode, we will examine this classic 1973 alien encounter, a case that became to be known as the Alabama Metal Man. Around 10 p.m. on October 17, 1973, Police Chief Jeff Greenhaw was relaxing at home, hoping to have a relaxing evening. Then the phone rang, and his life would change forever. Reports vary as to whether this caller was anonymous or Greenhaw knew the individual, but on the other end of the phone, someone was frantically telling him a UFO had landed in a nearby field. Chief Greenhaw grabbed his gun, keys, and Polaroid and sped toward the field. On the way there, he radioed the event to the station, but when he arrived, there was no UFO at the scene. He turned off his car and began canvassing the area. While no UFO was spotted, Chief Greenhaw did see something else, something that was truly bizarre. As he was walking around, he saw something just on the side of the road and shouted at it. He approached it to get a better look and could see that this was something like he had never seen before. The being was around 6 feet tall and appeared to be covered from head to foot in tinfoil. It began approaching the police vehicle. All its movements were extremely jerky and mechanical. The chief would snap 4 Polaroid pictures of the being. As it got closer, Chief Greenhaw turned on the headlights to the car. This seemed to scare it, and the entity took off running. The being was fast, extremely fast. Chief Greenhaw hopped in his vehicle and chased it through the field, but since the field was uneven terrain, he could only get up to 35 miles per hour. Notably though, the being was getting farther and farther away from him. The chief's car eventually fell into a ditch, and the being got away. Greenhaw would later recall the being was running faster than any human he had ever seen run. Like many alien encounters and UFO sightings, the event would take a life of its own after it happened. Greenhaw would tell his story, and it would wreck his life. The town mocked him and lost all respect for the young captain. Several weeks after reporting the incident, the town council would fire Captain Greenhaw. Soon, his wife would leave him, and to add insult to injury, Greenhaw's house burned down sometime after the report. Greenhaw would go into a deep depression and isolate from others. He recalled that he couldn't trust anyone, and many of his friends stabbed him in the back. While Greenhaw's case is surely a fascinating and a strange one, it is quite controversial. Author Charlton Hall would write a book claiming when he was a teenager, him and his friends faked several alien encounters in the Alabama area. Among these, Hall alleges he and his friends were responsible for the 1973 Alabama Metal Man. While Hall alleges to have faked the incidents, there are still questions surrounding the event. The most notable question surrounds the speed at which the being moved away. If it's true that the being ran at the speeds even close to what Chief Greenhaw alleges, then there's no way that these teenagers could have faked this. Still, much of the event could have been faked. The phone call could have been a prank. A teenager could have wrapped himself in tinfoil and created the alien costume. The mechanical movements as well could have been fabricated. Probably the key piece of evidence in this case are the photos. The photos were examined and have never been proved to be a hoax. Around 10 years after the event, the originals and negatives were stolen, but luckily copies were still around. Like many UFO sightings and alien encounters, the details in this photo are tough to make out and it's really inconclusive. As a result, this case really comes down to eyewitness testimony. One of the big hurdles for Jeff Greenhaw has to do with the fact that he was the sole witness. While many believe Greenhaw and its story, it's tough to substantiate stories like this with just one eyewitness. To make matters worse, this case occurred in the early 1970s, a time when reporting a UFO or an alien encounter was definitely met with ridicule. This has led many to speculate there are many other undocumented cases out there. It's important to note too, there have been other cases of robotic-like aliens, so these are not really that rare. One case we covered on this channel earlier was one involving the Cisco Grove encounter. The case of the Alabama Metal Man has inspired much, appearing in television and books and being a popular Southern alien encounter. One final point concerning this case is that Jeff Greenhaw never wavered around what he saw. He regretted reporting it since it caused him so much pain, but he has remained adamant about the events of that night. On the afternoon of September 4th, 1964, Donald Schramm set out on a hunting adventure with friends in Cisco Grove, California. Cisco Grove is a small community that resides in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in the Tahoe National Forest. Donald was an experienced hunter, and the group planned on hunting deer only with bow and arrow. In the early afternoon, the group separated and spread out in the woods, planning to meet back at the campsite before it fell dark. As the afternoon progressed, Donald would go way off course, searching for a deer. Little did he know that he had gone quite astray. As nighttime fell, he was far from base camp and decided to spend the night in a tree in order to avoid predators. That night, a predator did come, but it was unlike anything he could have ever imagined. In this episode, we will examine Donald Schramm's 1964 strange and terrifying alien encounter. On the night of September 4th, 1964, armed with just a bow and arrow, 26-year-old Donald Schramm scaled a tree with the intention of sleeping the night there and heading back to camp once daytime arrived. Donald hadn't spotted any deer earlier that day, which he thought was somewhat strange. As he sat, buckled to the tree, Donald would notice a white light soon hovering above them. It was zigzagging at a low altitude just over the treetops. Initially, Donald believed that it was a rescue helicopter and that his friends, concerned he hadn't returned to camp, reported him missing. Donald decided to try and draw attention to the white light by lighting a flare. After several flares, the white light drastically turned and started heading toward him. He climbed down the tree, and the craft stopped around 50 yards from the tree. Donald realized then it was making no noise, and this was not a helicopter. He quickly ascended the tree in order to hide. The craft was big, around 150 feet long, dark-colored and cigar-shaped. A portal opened up on it, and a smaller, silver-colored craft descended to the trees. Donald remained as still as possible in the tree, attempting to stay hidden. After around 5 minutes, he saw 2 beings walking through the woods. They wore tight silver suits, were around 45 feet tall, and humanoid. They began collecting soil samples, and Donald, who was around 15 feet in the air, remained hidden. Then, as the beings were walking away from him, accidentally Donald moved in the tree. Some twigs snapped, and the beings heard the noise. They turned around, looked upward, and spotted Donald. They made some type of strange noise, and soon Donald would hear a third being approach. This one was different and appeared to be a robot, not biological. The torso was box-shaped, the legs and arms looked made of metal, and the head was square. The robot had red eyes and approached the base of the tree along with the 2 humanoids. The beings tried shaking the tree to knock Donald down, but were unsuccessful. After this failed, the robot looked up toward Donald, opened its jaws, and a white mist flew out from its mouth. Donald tried his best to avoid the mist, but he inhaled it, and it paralyzed him. In a few moments' time, he passed out, buckled to the tree. He woke up and felt nauseous, and the beings were still down below the tree. As he regained his strength, he shot an arrow directly in the chest of the robot, causing sparks to fly everywhere. The 3 beings backed off and retreated away from the base of the tree. They then began approaching again, and Donald would shoot another arrow at the robot, striking it once again. At this point, the beings continued to try and attack Donald throughout the night. The robot continued spewing the white vapor, and it knocked Donald out again and again. Each time he awoke, the beings were closer and trying to get him down from the tree. Donald continued to fire arrows. Once he ran out, he started to throw things at the beings. He started lighting his clothing on fire and dropping it on them to discourage them. This fight went on all night. Then, with only a few hours left, Donald was struggling. The beings were still relentlessly attacking, yet he was exhausted. More beings had came and gone throughout the night, and Donald was forced to fend them off by any means necessary. Not only was he exhausted, but with much of his clothing burned, he was freezing. He would pass out once more. Donald then woke up to the sun rising, and the beings were all gone. He scaled down the tree and used his compass to get him back to base camp. He arrived and was exhausted. He told his friends what had happened, and they believed him, as one of the other hunters had seen the larger craft while he was out. Once Donald got home, he told his wife and a few others. Word would reach the Air Force, who came and interviewed Donald. The interview was very secretive, but the agent seemed very interested in the story. Still, nothing came from the matter, and it was closed by the Air Force as something explainable. Donald would suffer from PTSD for years after the event. He was unable to tell his story because he worked at a top-secret missile facility. Regardless, he eventually lost his job due to the stress of the event. Donald decided to tell his story years later. In 2011, he would write a book about his experience. In the book, Aliens in the Woods, the Cisco Grove Encounter. The book details the 12-hour fight that endured between him and the aliens. Still, it's important to point out that prior to Donald publishing the book, this case was investigated by several ufologists who deemed Donald to be credible. In addition, they verified the other hunter spotted the craft that night as well. This helps the credibility of the case, although there are certainly some questionable aspects. First, there was only one witness to the fight. A second weakness concerns the behavior of the beings and the story in general. For example, how are advanced beings unable to knock down a tree? This is an interesting question, and it's tough to imagine with advanced technology they couldn't knock it down. It could be the case, though, they weren't familiar with the material. They were collecting evidence of the soil and the surrounding area in tubes. In addition, it might be they needed him alive or wanted him alive, and they thought cutting down the tree might kill him. Another criticism has to do with the fight itself. It's tough to imagine they couldn't have taken Donald. We've seen many alien abduction cases where the beings come in locked homes. In most alien abduction cases, the beings are able to take the abductees with little effort. Once again, though, their mindset might have stopped them from doing this. They almost surely wanted to get Donald alive. Donald, by all accounts, has been said to be a credible individual. His story was somewhat backed up by another witness seeing the craft. While we'll never know for sure what happened that day, this is surely a fascinating story that might give one pause before heading out into the woods. On December 19th, 1973, a 28-year-old Belgian man awoke in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After using it, he began walking back to his bedroom through the kitchen when suddenly he spotted a green glow coming through the curtains. The half-asleep man decided to peer through the window, and what he saw next stunned him. In this episode, we will examine this strange close encounter of the third kind, a case that has become to be known as the Vilvoorde encounter. Around 2 a.m. on December 19th, 1973, a Belgian man who used the pseudonym Mr. V spotted a greenish glow coming through the window and decided to investigate. As he looked through, he would be stunned to see a 3-foot-tall humanoid walking around his garden. It was carrying some sort of electronic device, like a metal detector, and scanning the ground. Initially, the entity had its back turned toward the man as Mr. V watched. The being's outfit consisted of a one-piece tight-fitted suit that emitted a greenish glow. It was wearing a transparent helmet, and a tube ran from the helmet to something on its back. Whatever was on its back was pretty big, covering the majority of it. The entity also had a red box on its abdomen area, although it's not clear what the purpose of it was. As Mr. V couldn't believe his eyes, he decided to shine his flashlight through the closed window to get a better look. The being saw the light and began turning around. Still, the alien didn't move fluidly, as it couldn't just turn around partly and had to turn around its whole body. Mr. V believed its neck was completely rigid. In general, the being seemed to have trouble walking and had a strange gait. As the entity turned around, Mr. V finally got to see the face. The eyes were yellow and almond-shaped, shining very brightly. He couldn't make out much in the face area, whether the being had a mouth or nose. It could have been the darkness covering it, or perhaps the being didn't have either. As it looked up at Mr. V, it began to raise its hand in response to the light. It lifted its hand and made a V signal with it. After this, it turned back around and began waddling toward the back wall of the garden, which was around 10 feet tall. What happened next would truly astonish Mr. V, though. The being placed 1 foot flat on the wall and began walking up it. The odd sight was truly unbelievable, as its gait stayed the same, and the position of the metal detector device was the same on the wall. As it reached the top, it began descending down once again, with its feet flat against the wall. Eventually, it was back on the ground, and although Mr. V couldn't see it directly, he could see the greenish glow moving. A few moments later, a white light appeared on the ground not too far away. Then a craft began to rise 20 to 30 feet off the ground and hovered in the same position for around 4 minutes. It was making a sound similar to crickets or insects. The object was around 15 feet in diameter. The top half was orange colored and had a dome emitting a greenish light. Mr. V was able to see the being in this dome. On the orange portion, there was a symbol that was a black circle with a yellow lightning bolt going through it. The bottom half of the craft had a deep purplish color and had 3 lights along the bottom. The lights were red, yellow, and blue and flashed together in unison. It then began rising, and the churring sound grew louder, and the craft rocked back and forth and then shot off into the sky, disappearing. The man then sat down in the kitchen in disbelief as far as what he had witnessed. He had something to eat, thinking about what had just happened, and soon went to bed. Other than the V-wave, the being hadn't tried to communicate with the man in any other way, such as telepathy. It's important to point out the man felt no fear during the experience and went to bed shortly after eating. The next day, the man would walk outside in the garden. He was quite surprised to see no evidence had been left behind by the being. There were no footprints in the garden, and everything appeared normal. So was this just a lucid dream, or did this man really see a green glowing alien scanning his backyard? It seems almost surely like a dream, and with no physical evidence left behind, there's certainly room to doubt this encounter. Still, it's important to note the man watched the being in craft for quite some time. In addition, he made a snack for himself while pondering what he had seen. That does add some support to his case. Skeptics will point out that people do all sorts of odd things, like sleepwalking, and more than likely, Mr. V had a very strange dream. While we'll never know for sure, the case is still a fascinating one. On August 6, 1977, a Georgia man would set off on a walk and have an experience he would never forget. Tom Dawson, a 63-year-old retired auto salesman, would spot a UFO and eventually encounter 7 strange beings. The event terrified Tom and almost scared him to death. Right after it, he was so frightened and worked up he had to be hospitalized for hysteria. In this episode, we will examine the frightening alien encounter experienced by Tom Dawson. On August 6, 1977, around 10:30 in the morning, Tom Dawson began walking toward the pond on his property, accompanied by his dogs, to see if he should try and fish later in the day. As Tom walked in the fence that surrounded the pond, he would be stunned to see a UFO suddenly fly in. It began hovering between the trees and settled just a few feet off the ground. Tom was terrified, and to make things worse, just moments after the UFO settled, he found himself somehow paralyzed and unable to move. In addition, his 2 dogs were frozen as well as some nearby cattle. The UFO was around 50 feet in diameter and about 15 feet high. It was hovering silently and had a base color of silver, although there were other colors flashing and changing quickly. It was saucer-shaped, had a dome on top, and also had several portholes beneath the dome. The craft would descend further toward the ground, and then a ramp came down toward the ground. Then Tom would be horrified to see 7 humanoids start descending down a ramp. They were pale, around 5 feet tall, and had pointed ears and pointed noses. Some had tight-fitted silver outfits on, while others wore nothing. The first one to exit the ramp put their foot down softly on the ground, as if it was testing the surface. In other words, it seemed this species had never actually set foot on Earth. There is more support for this theory as well later on, as Tom saw they were collecting soil and leaf samples. Tom noted once the entity was able to plant its foot safely on the surface, the rest followed down the ramp. They approached Tom, and next the beings would perform some type of medical test on Tom. As they spoke some type of gibberish to one another, The beings placed some type of helmet-like device on his head. They also wrapped his midsection with something. While some of the entities were examining him, other ones were collecting samples of the soil and leaves. Once the test concluded, the beings went back up the ramp, the door shut, and the craft flew away at lightning speeds. As the craft flew away, Tom Dawson was released from his paralysis and began running back toward his home. He stopped by his neighbors, but being so worked up, all he could manage to say was spaceship. Tom was eventually taken to the hospital and treated for hysteria. He was given a sedative to calm him down. He would later recall that he believed the entities probably didn't take him because he was older. Tom's story is surely an interesting one and shares many common characteristics with other alien encounters and abductions. The beings appear to be Nordic aliens, although they were shorter than other reports of Nordics. One other thing to point out is that the paralysis is something else that many other individuals who have these experiences report. Still, most often paralysis tends to be reported while people are laying down, which leads skeptics to say they are experiencing sleep paralysis, a documented medical phenomenon. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this case is that it occurred in the daytime. It's somewhat unusual to get reports of people experiencing these paralysis cases in broad daylight, although it's not unheard of. So did the beings plan to take Tom or not? This is tough to say, as they surely had some type of interest in him. One interesting thing Tom reported was that it appears, since they were hesitant to walk on the soil, they might have just came here for the first time. It's not known if Tom ever came in contact with these entities again. Hopefully, though, he was able to recover from his traumatic experience and enjoy the rest of his retirement. In August 1979, a British woman in Gateshead was laying in bed in the wee hours of the morning. It was a tough night for the woman as her husband was away working the graveyard shift and she had terrible tooth pain. While her night was bad, it was about to get much worse. In this episode, we will examine this very strange UFO sighting and the alien encounters experienced by this British woman. In August 1979, as the young woman laid in bed, trying to fall asleep, she decided to sit up in bed and drink some tea to soothe her tooth pain. As she was sipping her tea, she would notice a faint red light coming through the curtains. The red light began getting brighter and more prominent. This prompted the woman, who used the pseudonym of Carol for the report, to rush to the window. There, she would be stunned to see a disc-shaped craft hovering over her street. The object was multicolored, floating silently. Carol would then watch the craft shoot off quickly into the distance and disappear. The event frightened Carol, but she managed to crawl back into bed. However, Carol wouldn't be going to sleep anytime soon. Moments after she got into bed, a tiny UFO flew in through the window. It was around 18 inches in circumference, and oddly, a trail of something that resembled glitter trailed it. The tiny UFO wasn't silent and was buzzing loudly over the bed. After a few minutes, the craft flew through the bedroom door and vanished. Around 2 weeks later, the tiny craft would visit Carol once again. As Carol was putting her daughter in bed, the craft flew in the house. Once again it buzzed, and Carol screamed for her husband. Right as she yelled, the craft took off, and her husband never saw it. The visits by this tiny craft had surely frightened Carol, but things were about to get much more frightening. The next time Carol's husband went to work the graveyard shift, she decided to take the children and go to her mother's home. That night, Carol woke up around 4 a.m. paralyzed and would be horrified to see the tiny craft had followed her to her mother's home. The object was buzzing over the bed once again, and to Carol's horror, the craft hadn't come alone. There were around 12 small beings in the room. The entities were around 2 feet tall, wearing white suits, and seemed to have fake hair, similar to a doll. They walked around her bed, and a paralyzed Carol could only look on in horror. The beings seemed to communicate with one another through clicking sounds. The beings examined Carol while she laid there, helpless. For the next 2 months, Carol continued to have these types of experiences. A tiny UFO entered the room, along with tiny humanoids. One interesting aspect of this case is that Carol's dog barked furiously each time the small craft entered the room. The behavior of the dog seems to suggest that Carol probably wasn't dreaming the experience, as the dog would often knock things over, and others in her home would complain of the barking the next day. In addition, people who slept around Carol too would report hearing the strange humming sound from her bedroom. While it's not clear exactly what the entities did to her and why, we do know these visitations did stop after about 2 months, letting Carol finally get the rest she needed. What can we make of this strange encounter and these tiny UFO visitations? There's several interesting aspects to it. First is the size of the UFO. Tiny UFOs are not what people typically think of with UFOs, but it's important to point out that these are not unheard of. A classic and famous case of this occurred in Kaki City in Japan in August 1972. Then, Michio Seo, a 13-year-old boy, was on his way home from school when he spotted a tiny metallic object hovering over a rice field. He would go, grab his friends, and the group would have several encounters with it. They even managed to capture it, photograph it, but the tiny object vanished without a trace. We covered this incredible story on a prior episode of The Street of Silence. Tiny UFOs raise lots of questions surrounding the UFO phenomena. For example, how many of these UFOs have came and been undetected? It's certainly possible that one could fly down and camouflage itself, hiding much easier than a bigger craft. These tiny UFOs could present more opportunities to gather information than having a regular-sized ship. Did this event occur, though? It's definitely not a case with overwhelming evidence, but it appears that unless the woman fabricated the story, these events might have occurred. While it could have been a dream, the noises reported by others seem to suggest that Carol did experience these events. Still, since she remained anonymous and has no type of physical proof, skeptics will certainly not take the case seriously. Despite this, the case doesn't have any elements or red flags that immediately lead us to believe it was faked. Still, like many UFO sightings and alien encounters, the majority of the evidence lies in the witness and her testimony. In November 2000, Russian Alexei Tikhonovich woke up in the middle of the night and would have a strange encounter with an extraterrestrial. The story was documented by Russian ufologist Gennady Belemov and shares many characteristics we see in other alien encounters. Unlike some other cases, though, the being doesn't come across as threatening or frightening. In this episode, we will examine this strange alien encounter that happened on November 11th, 2000 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Around 2 a.m. on November 11th, 2000, Alexei Tikhonovich woke up in the middle of the night to a feeling of dread. He got up and started wandering around his home, checking on the children and other rooms to make sure they were safe. Everything seemed ordinary, and Alexei began heading back toward his bedroom. When he arrived, though, he was stunned to see a figure near his bedroom doorway. Alexei ran into the room scared and grabbed a stick to protect himself and his family. The being then told Alexei to remain calm. An upset Alexei asked how he got in the home, and the being reiterated that he had come in peace. Alexei approached the being, but now could make out more details. The being was around 6 feet tall, wearing a tight-fitted gray piece onesuit. He had short dark hair, a chiseled face, and looked Russian. While the stranger looked human, Alexei knew it was not. He then put down his stick and asked the being where it had came from. The entity said that it had come from somewhere far away and traveled to different parts of the earth. The beings have studied us for a long time, and it pointed out how we polluted our planet. Alexei would ask how they cleaned their planet, what was being used, and the being said it was much cleaner there on Earth. He went on to highlight the terrible technologies used on planet Earth by us. The conversation continued, and Alexei would note the being was shocked to learn he served in the army. On its planet, there was no need for an army, and any rule breakers were sent off the planet. The being stressed they taught their children correctly from a young age. Alexei would soon realize that the conversation was all occurring through telepathy at this point. Alexei asked some other questions around technology, and the being gave vague answers on the topic. Alexei would then turn his head as he heard a house noise, and when he looked back, the being had disappeared. He went over to the window and saw a white light that soon vanished. The next few days, Alexei would get very sick. The being had mentioned in their conversation that this might happen to him as he was being exposed to some chemicals from the alien. The story of Alexei's encounter is certainly an interesting one. Although brief, Alexei experienced what so many others have in these alien encounters. The being spoke through telepathy, discussed how their society was a utopian-like, and also stressed how human beings were destroying planet Earth. We've seen this occur in a number of alien encounters and alien abductions, many of which we have covered on this channel. One other thing is the alien's outfit. We've seen many individuals who've experienced alien encounters report the one-piece silver, tight-fitted suit. By all accounts, it seems this was Alexei's only encounter with extraterrestrials, and he was able to get back and live a normal life. There's been quite a number of alien encounters and alien abductions reported throughout the decades. However, there are few documented cases before the late 1940s. Much of this is probably due to the explosion of ufology in the late 1940s after the Roswell UFO crash, as well as the Kenneth Arnold sighting. In 1940, though, one man, a Dutch immigrant living out west, would have a strange encounter with extraterrestrials and enter their craft. In this episode, we will examine the incredible story of Udo Wartena and his alien encounter. Udo Wartena came to the United States and began working as a miner just outside Helena, Montana. In April of 1940, he was working for Northwest Mining Company, but in his spare time, Udo had discovered a glacial deposit at the base of Boulder Mountain on his property. Udo believed that the site had gold, and thus he had been spending much time there. 1 month later, in May 1940, Udo was moving some large rocks when he heard a strange humming sound. At first, he ignored it and kept working. Soon, though, Udo became curious and decided to see what it was. To his amazement, Udo spotted a large, disc-shaped craft. It was around 35 feet high and 100 feet long. It looked like the classic UFO, being 2 inverted saucers and silver in color. As Udo watched, suddenly a door opened and a stairway came down. A man, or what looked like a man, proceeded to walk down the stairs. Udo wasn't scared at the time and was quite curious. He began walking toward the being, and the being approached him. They stopped about 12 feet apart. Then the being looked at Udo in a friendly manner and approached him, extending a handshake. The being was wearing an all-gray suit, appeared around his mid-30s in age, and explained that they weren't aware anyone was in the area. The being went on to tell Udo they didn't like to be seen by others and usually stayed in the shadows. The being asked Udo if they could take some water, and Udo said yes. Next, some type of hose came down from the craft and began sucking up the water. The two would converse for some time when finally the being asked Udo if it wanted to come on board the craft. Udo agreed. As he entered it, he no longer heard the buzzing sound from the craft. The first room he entered was small, around 16 by 12 feet. There were cushioned seats around the room. In the room, an older man with white-colored hair came in and greeted Udo. Udo would ask the man what their age was, and the older man replied, about 900 years old. The other man was 600 years old. The two old Udo, they knew over 500 languages. Udo was curious why they needed the water. The beings would tell him that the hydrogen extracted from the water was their source of fuel. They also went on to tell him that they preferred to pull the water from the stream, not the lake, as it was cleaner and free of algae. The beings then went on to explain and show Udo how the ship was powered. There were two flywheels, or rings, spinning in opposite directions. That gave the ship its own gravity and allowed it to overcome the gravitational forces of planet Earth. The beings also said it generated an electromagnetic force, a concept that confused Udo. Udo described the flywheels as being around 3 feet long and around several inches thick. He would then ask about the power source, but the beings didn't explain what they used exactly. They did go on to tell him that it was essential for mankind to develop its own cheaper energy source. The conversation continued, and the beings said they were able to travel great distances by skipping upon the light waves. In essence, the craft was able to travel faster than the speed of light by using a distortion of space-time to allow Earth to push it away and towards its destination. While Udo didn't understand pretty much anything of this and the physics behind the explanation, he seemed to recall the basics. The beings didn't say much about their original planet, but did point toward it, letting Udo know they weren't from here. They would then discuss their purpose. Since they looked just like us, they said they had been living among us from time to time, trying to help us out. They didn't give specifics, but their message was that they wanted to make sure we were progressing in the right way. The conversation then took an awkward turn. Udo asked about religion, and the beings said they refused to comment on the matter, stating they weren't allowed to interfere in any way. There's been speculation by some that many of these beings are actually demons, and that by using Jesus' name, they would have to leave. Next, the beings scanned Udo to see if he had any impurities in his body. It's important to point out that Udo volunteered for the procedure. Nothing really came of the scan, and soon the beings had extracted all the water they needed. He was then asked if he wanted to continue on in space with them, but leaving behind his life was too much for Udo. After this, the beings would warn Udo not to speak of his experience, and Udo, not thinking anyone would believe him anyway, agreed. Interestingly, the beings said he was welcome to discuss the experience later in his life. Udo walked off the ship and soon turned around and saw the craft hovering in the sky. It shot off and disappeared into space. He had spoke with them for about 2 hours and felt incredibly weak after speaking with them. For years, Udo never spoke of the event, and then in 1989, at the age of 86, Udo was on his deathbed and he would tell his experience to his close friends and family. In addition, he wrote down notes of the event so nothing would be lost. Eventually, Australian UFO researcher Warren Aston would get the details surrounding this case. Since Udo had passed, he went by Udo's written account and also by speaking with those who Udo confided in. What can we make of this incredible alien encounter? The story of Udo Wartena has several interesting aspects to it. First, what Udo reported is very typical of other witness reports. Udo saw a typical UFO, saucer-shaped and chrome-colored. Also, he encountered human-like aliens. Several other cases report encounters with human-like beings. Often, these are thought to be tall whites or Nordic aliens, but it's surely possible encounters with these human-like beings are not the Nordics. The message and many things the aliens gave to Udo is also consistent with others who have communicated with extraterrestrials. For example, we know the beings seem concerned about how we are destroying planet Earth. Also, there are cases where individuals are asked to leave Earth and come with the beings. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this case has to do with the technology the being showed Udo. While Udo surely wasn't able to get a full grasp on how it worked, the fact that he understood that the beings used anti-gravity and electromagnetism to propel their craft is important. We've heard this from many individuals that have alleged to come in contact with these crafts. While the story could be completely fabricated, there are two reasons I don't believe it is. One, as mentioned, the story has consistencies that match many other UFO and alien encounter cases. Second, Udo told the story right before he was going to die. After the event, Udo went on to marry and start a family, so it's understandable he kept his secret even from his wife for all those years. For what reason would a dying man tell this story? Unfortunately, it would have been nice to get a UFO researcher to speak with him and possibly uncover any other details. Still though, this case appears to be a credible one and is quite fascinating. In 1989, the American science fiction film Communion was released. The film follows Whitley Strieber, played by Christopher Walken, as a successful family man plagued by strange and frightening dreams. In the movie, we see Strieber eventually come full circle and realize the truth. He has been abducted by aliens his entire life. While Strieber's case is well known, what's less known is the extent of the alien abductions in the Hudson Valley area during the 1980s. While many happened in 1983 and 1984, UFO reports continued throughout the decade and even into present day. It's not clear how many occurred or why, but there were hundreds, maybe thousands of reports of UFOs seen around the area, while skeptics quickly attributed the sightings to a group of pilots flying in a V formation and tricking many people. The fact remains, many unexplainable sightings and events happened. For example, several security guards witnessed a 900-foot UFO over Indian nuclear power plant in June 1984. In addition to all the sightings, many alien encounters and abductions were reported as well. Many of these cases are covered in the book Night Siege, the Hudson Valley UFO Sightings, co-authored by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Mr. Bob Pratt, and Philip Abrogno. In this episode, we will dive into one of the cases examined by Imbrogno, as well as briefly discuss the Hudson Valley UFO sightings and the flawed thinking about this event. In late June 1987, around 10 p.m., a woman who wished to remain anonymous was lying down in her bed, getting ready to sleep. Suddenly, the woman felt a sense of dread, as if someone or something was watching her. She sensed it, but saw no one. She then heard a voice speak in her head, and it said, "We have come for you." You will not be hurt." The woman realized at this point she was paralyzed and couldn't move her body. The voice in her head was like nothing she had ever experienced. She couldn't speak or scream, but she could move her eyes. The woman was divorced, and her 17-year-old daughter was away at her ex-husband's. As she moved her eyes in the doorway, she could see in the dimly lit hall that there were 3 beings lined up in a single file line. The first being strangely seemed to be trying to get in the room. It was as if something was blocking it, and the woman could see the being press something against the doorway to allow them to enter. As they came in, the woman was terrified. She could make out more details on the beings. They were around 5 feet tall, with long arms. They had large heads and huge eyes. They didn't talk, but communicated with each other telepathically, and the woman could hear buzzing noises in her head. Next, the entities approached the bed, and the leader went to the right-hand side of it. Another alien went to her left, and one remained at the foot of the bed. The one on the left took a tube of something like cotton and began pushing it up against her nostril. The woman felt horrific pain and passed out. The next day, she woke up around 8 a.m. with a pounding headache. She went to the bathroom, and both sides of her nostrils were bleeding. She felt like she had something in her nose, and her nose was extremely swollen. She hoped that what had happened to her was a dream, but it wasn't adding up. Not only was her nose in terrible pain, but she had rashes on her body too. What happened next, though, would truly shock the woman. When her daughter returned home that night, the woman started telling the story to her daughter. However, before she could even finish, the daughter started trembling and saying that last night around the same time, she and her dad had an extraterrestrial experience. They were driving near Croton Falls, New York, when a boomerang-shaped UFO started following them. The father and daughter would experience around 30 minutes of missing time that night. On July 2nd, 1987, the woman would contact UFO investigator Philip Improgno about the event. He would document and interview the witnesses. Several weeks later, the woman would call Philip once again. She went on to say the experience happened again, even more strange. It happened in almost the exact same way when her daughter was away. This case is one of many that happened during what became to be known as the Hudson Valley UFO sightings, or the Westchester Boomerang. While many of the sightings were due to misidentification, we see skeptics do what they do all too often: attribute all cases to be misidentification if one or several are found to be not credible. We see this with other phenomena as well, most notably crop circles. In 1991, 2 men alleged to have hoaxed many of the circles. Doug Bauer and his friend Dave Charlie admitted to a reporter, Graham Bro, that in the late 1970s they had begun using planks of wood with ropes attached to each end to stamp circles in crops by holding the ropes in their hands and pressing the planks underfoot. After this came out, all crop circles were ruled as pranks, although many questions still remain. For example, how could the 2 men in one night bend the stalls, weave them together, and have the time to create such intricate patterns? Also, how were they able to anatomically alter the stem of the crops? The science tells us in many of these circles, the stems have been lengthened. This allowed the stem to be bent, and then they are woven together in intricate patterns. In addition, the crops continue to remain alive and grow. If men were stomping on the crops and creating the circles, how come we are seeing all this unexplainable phenomena? In sum, like the crop circle phenomena, the Hudson Valley UFO sightings appear to be a combination of legit and illegitimate cases. In the case prior discussed, the woman's case appears to be very stereotypical of many alien abductions, she was paralyzed, which we often see, and it appears the beings put some sort of alien implant in her. There's been a number of cases of people finding implants in their body, and there's lots of speculation about what their purpose is. Like many, this woman appears to be getting repeatedly abducted. This is not uncommon, and the fact her entire family is probably being taken is not that unusual as well. It's not clear what happened to this woman and whether she still had visitations. Hopefully, though, the visitation stopped and she was able to move on with her life. In May 1954, two Peruvians living in the city of Ayacucho would have a bizarre encounter in their home. Carlos and Anita Jimenez had spent their afternoon shopping, buying groceries, and doing other things. As they returned home to their small house in the city, the couple began unloading groceries in their kitchen. Then, a noise that sounded like footsteps came from the upstairs. Anita grabbed Carlos, and as the two headed up, they saw something they would never forget. As the couple began going bedroom to bedroom, they didn't find anyone initially. Then Anita sensed that the intruder was in their bedroom. Anita pulled her husband, and the two stood outside the door, listening quietly. After a minute, they heard the footsteps in the bedroom. They quickly swung open the door, but were stunned at what was there. Across the bed, the two saw what appeared to be a very gorgeous woman. The two stood in the doorway and looked on in amazement. The being appeared to be surprised, but also annoyed that it had been found. The being was around 5 feet 6 inches tall. It had a golden tan and large, curly, dark brown hair. The being wore hoop earrings and sandals, along with what the witnesses described as skimpy attire. It had an avocado green swimsuit-like outfit. The being wore a short jacket similar to a bolero jacket. In addition, it had a strange white object on its arm. Anita would ask the being who she was and what it was doing. After staring at them for some time, the being said, in very broken Spanish, "My name is Julu, and I am not from here." After this, the intruder lifted its forearm, and on the white object on its arm, Carlos and Anita could see different lights up and down it. The being began pressing the different lights as if she was texting on a smartphone. Immediately, a red mist formed between Carlos and Anita and the being. An angered Carlos rushed toward the being, but as soon as he did, he hit the red mist. He screamed and fell onto the bedroom floor. Anita ran to help him as Carlos was in a state of shock. Carlos's fingertips were bright red and covered in blisters as if he had been burned. At this point, the being turned toward the bedroom wall, and on the wall, a gold light shined through it. It grew bigger and bigger until it covered the entire wall almost floor to ceiling. The being went into the light and then disappeared. Then the red mist vanished as well. Carlos and Anita would later describe the light as soft and appearing like oil on floating water. For some reason, after around 20 seconds, Anita opened the curtains in the direction the being went. She couldn't believe it when she saw it running down the street. It had normal clothes on and was easy to spot with its unique hair. The two rushed out and started chasing the being. The two had no luck though, as far ahead on the street, it flagged a cab and got away. Later they would report the encounter to the police. This case is certainly a fascinating one. It has several characteristics seen in other alien encounters, but also has some unique elements that raise questions. we've seen in other cases beings taking the form of gorgeous men or women. Also, there are many reports of beings walking or traveling through walls. Still, some of the elements of the case are strange and atypical, for example, the red mist appearing between the two. Also, it seems strange the being, after walking through the wall, couldn't just vanish completely. Ultimately, this case is only as good as the witness's statement. It seems like such a bizarre story that there would be almost no reason for the witnesses to create this. They most likely would have been met with ridicule in their community. Other than the UFO journal this was pulled from, it's hard to imagine that any other documentation, such as newspaper articles, exists for this. It's important to note many believe that we are being visited by multiple types of alien species. While gray aliens and Nordics are reported in the majority of cases, we do see quite a number of close encounters of the third kind where other types of beings are seen and reported. This leads many to believe that some of these odd beings could be either demonic or possibly interdimensional. This is difficult to know though, and should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. This case is definitely a fascinating one, but like many, would really benefit from additional details surrounding it. On August 29, 1967, around 10:30 a.m., two children in Cussac, France, would experience a close encounter of the third kind. Francois Delpouche, age 11, and his sister, Anne-Marie, age 9, were out in the pasture tending to their family's cattle when they would see what appeared to be children. However, as they moved closer and got a better look, it was evident these humanoids were anything but. In today's episode, we will examine the 1967 Cussac encounter. August 29, 1967, was a clear and sunny day in the village of Cussac. By all accounts, up until this day, no strange activity or sightings had occurred in the area. However, that would soon change. As Francois was directing the cattle, he would turn around and spot something across the road in the distance. They were around 120 feet away and behind a low rock wall and some trees and bushes. At first, Francois believed they were other children, so he began looking more closely through the shrubs. Quickly, though, he concluded this was something strange. Anne-Marie climbed on the wall as well, and soon the two would look on in amazement at something truly extraordinary. As the two looked on, they viewed a bright orb around 6 feet in diameter. It appeared to have a silver undertone, although it was bright and tough to see. There were 3 legs underneath it, lifting it a few feet off the ground. There were 4 beings, all of different sizes, and all appearing shiny black. It's not clear if these were suits or just how the alien's skin looked. The children couldn't see any features on the beings, though. The children spotted the beings doing different things. One of them appeared to be bending over, collecting soil samples. Another being was holding a reflective type of device and waving it, possibly signaling to the others. The other 2 were walking around as if they were exploring the terrain. A confused Francois then yelled to the beings, "Have you come to play with us?" At this time, the beings, most likely unaware that they were being watched, realized that they now had been seen. Suddenly, one of the beings levitated off the ground and went head first into the top of the spear. It was followed in a similar fashion by the second and third beings. The craft then began to rise, even though one of the entities was not in it. The landing gear appeared to just disappear, although Anne-Marie would later say it may have just been too bright to see it. The craft had risen around 50 feet in the air and began moving away. The being holding the reflective device appeared to drop it. After picking it up, the entity started running after the orb. Once it got underneath, it dove head first into the bright orb, as the others had did. As the craft began to rise higher, it became brighter and stopped. Then suddenly it shot off quickly to the northwest. Right after this happened, a sulfur smell soon reached the children and the other animals. Both the cattle and the dog were very agitated and anxious for some time. The children would tell their father, who went and got the police. At the scene, the police would confirm in their police report the smell of sulfur and dried grass as well, where the children said the craft took off. After the sighting, Francois' eyes would hurt for some time. For days after he woke up, his eyes were watering. Anne-Marie didn't experience this side effect though. After the event, the children were interviewed by UFO investigators Joel Mesnard and Claude Pavey. Both investigators noted they questioned Anne-Marie with continuous questions, trying to uncover inconsistencies. She appeared somewhat shy, but was consistent in her answers. After interviewing her, they questioned Francois. Both stories aligned. In March 2007, France released a number of UFO documents on their government website. The site crashed the first few hours it was released due to a high volume of web traffic, but this case was one of several that stood out for being so credible. UFO cases with children are often some of the most compelling, as it's difficult to imagine that children could stand up to the rigorous questioning. Some of the most credible UFO cases, such as the Zimbabwe aerial school incident, reflect this. In that case, dozens of students and a teacher had a close encounter of the third kind in the year 1994. Decades later, all the witnesses remain adamant about their experience to that day. While children are certainly capable of lying or exaggerating, it seems that an adult is much more likely to fool an investigator. By all accounts, it seems that this was the only sighting in the area. It seems that both Francois and Anne-Marie didn't experience any other negative side effects and were able to go on and live normal lives. On November 9th, 1979, a Scottish forestry worker would have one of the most famous extraterrestrial encounters in the history of the country. Bob Taylor showed up to work expecting to have a normal day of work, however his experience would be anything but. In time, this case became famous for being the first UFO sighting to be subject of a police criminal investigation. In fact, this case has never been solved, and the lead investigator on it has pointed out the unexplainable physical evidence found at the scene. In this episode, we will examine the extraordinary story of Bob Taylor, a case that became to be known as the Livingston Incident, or sometimes the Taylor Incident. Around 10:30 a.m. on November 9th, 1979, Bob Taylor, who was employed by the Livingston Development Corporation, drove his truck and parked at the bottom of Detchmont Law. Detchmont Law is a hill that sits in West Livingston, Scotland. Along with his dogs, Bob began climbing the hill for his daily routine, checking fences and gates. As Bob crested one portion of the hill, he would be stunned to see something incredible. In a clearing not too far away, Bob saw a dome-shaped object around 20 feet across and 30 feet high. The object was dark and had looked like it was rough sandpaper. Next, what happened would truly be shocking. A curious Bob and his dogs approached the craft, and two balls came down from the ship. They were around 3 feet across with metal spikes protruding through them. They began rolling towards Bob and attached themselves to his pants. Bob's dogs were barking furiously, but it clearly wasn't stopping the objects. The two balls began pulling Bob closer to the larger craft, and Bob smelled some type of burning odor. He would then pass out. Bob next woke up on the ground, and he would be perplexed about what had happened. He had a terrible headache, a sore throat, and a bitter taste for some reason in his mouth. He believes he was unconscious for around 20 minutes. The UFO and the two small balls were gone, but Bob was disheveled. He struggled to walk, but finally got back down to his truck. After a short time driving, due to the experience, he drove into a ditch and was forced to walk home. As he got home, Bob's wife would be stunned to see him. His clothes were torn and muddy, and he had scrapes all over his body. She called the police and a doctor, and soon Bob would take the police to the site of the incident. There, the clearing had strange indentations which appeared like ladder marks. There were also indentations where the balls had rolled up Bob. Detective Con Ian Wark, a crime scene investigator and detective that worked that day, said that he had found strange marks on the ground that day. Detective Wark said there were around 32 holes, around 3.5 inches in diameter, and also marks very much like those of tracks left by bulldozers. The holes seemed to align with the proportions of the balls described by Bob. The police report from that day would indicate something that weighed tons was in the clearing. However, there were no tracks coming into the clearing, not to mention it was a difficult place for heavy machinery to access. In addition, records from companies using heavy machinery in the area didn't indicate that anything was there that day, nor did Bob's employer. Something had caused these massive indentations, but there was simply no logical explanation. In 2019, Detective Wark would tell the BBC he interviewed Bob 3 times back then, and his story stayed consistent each time. The police opened a criminal investigation into the matter, but were never able to solve it. In time, this became an incredibly popular case in Scotland and the United Kingdom, even posting a plaque where the event alleged to take place occurred. There's been many individuals who have studied the case over the years, both ufologists and skeptics. Skeptic Stuart Scamble investigated the event and believed the indentations were caused by PVC pipes laid nearby. He also stated that Bob might have had an epileptic seizure that caused him to pass out. However, neither of these explanations hold up very well to scrutiny. PVC pipes are smooth and would have left a different indentation in the area, not to mention there's no evidence that they were even stacked there. Supporters of the event taking place, including ufologist Malcolm Robinson, point out tears in Bob's pants can't really be explained by him crawling. Bob's pants were police issued and they wouldn't have been ripped from him crawling on the ground. It's important to point out as well that Bob was a respected member of the community. Bob was a war hero and an avid member of the church. There wasn't much doubt about if Bob was lying. It's just some people think he was mistaken and there might be another explanation. Still, it appears no one has been able to explain the strange indentations after all these years. While Bob could have made up or imagined the whole story, the fact is he couldn't have fabricated the physical evidence at the scene. In 2007, Bob would pass away. He never changed or wavered on his story.